Good morning. Previously, I talked about how the upcoming lunar month from July 17th through August 16th will affect the world at large. And uh, in that talk, I foresaw probably a lot of activity, stress, and chaos in the month ahead for the world in general. Today, I want to talk about its impact specifically on America. And the good news is that even though we're going to have our challenges, things will probably be better for America than the world at large. We have some good aspects, trines and sextiles, that are going to uh, help us release a lot of that tension and move forward. So let's see if I can share my screen and then we can talk about things. And just give me a minute to get things set here. Okay. And I think we're ready to go. The lunar month for America, July 17th, 2023 through August 16th, 2023. This will be a period from one new moon to the next. And here I have, let's see, the chart for the new moon on the outside, chart for America on the inside. And my preferred chart for America is not the July 4th, 1776 chart with Sagittarius rising that many people use. But instead, I prefer the July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passing of the Resolution for Independence. Uh, that is essentially when we really declared our independence. A couple of days later, the word was given to George Washington to uh, make that independence a reality. Okay, now there's not going to be that much difference between July 2nd and July 4th charts. The main difference is the moon. In the July 2nd chart, the moon is at 25 degrees Capricorn. And in July 4th charts, the moon has moved on to Aquarius. Aside from that, there's not going to be that much difference. So uh, what I say today is pretty much also going to apply to July 4th charts. Also, as I go through things, I'm not necessarily going to focus on every single aspect you see. The aspects that you do see are all going to be within a 1 degree orb. So I'm working only with tight astrological aspects. I'm also going to cover, for the most part, just those that last for a good while. They're the ones that are going to make the strongest impact. I'm not really going to talk about aspects by the sun because they're not going to last all that long. So let's see what's happening for America in this lunar month. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is transiting Chiron conjunct natal Chiron. Now, this conjunction is not going to be exact this summer, but it's going to be very, very close. It's going to be a near conjunction. We'll get some exact conjunctions next year, and the period during which this aspect, this conjunction will be within 1 degree of being exact, goes from June through about the first week in September. Okay. Now, a lot of people associate Chiron with wounding, but we don't really have within us, inside of us, a drive which says, let's wound ourselves today. That's not what Chiron is really about, in my opinion. Instead, Chiron is about transcendence. The planetoid Chiron resides between Saturn and Uranus. Sometimes it goes within the orbit of Saturn and sometimes outside of the orbit of Uranus. Chiron is the bridge between the personal and the transpersonal, between what can be seen and what can't be seen. So it's really urging us toward transcendence, but in the process, it sometimes has to break that hard Saturnian shell that we've erected around us. That causes the wounding, and then that wounding can be followed by healing and then finally transcendence. So, uh, with this conjunction, the big question is, are we going to experience wounding or transcendence? And historically, I think we get both. We tend to get collectively probably more wounding, but there are going to be some people who answer that higher call for transcendence that Chiron is sending out. So some people will make great spiritual progress, and some people are going to be their best selves. They're going to respond to a higher calling to serve humanity in the world rather than just their personal egos. Now, Chiron gets very, very close to exact conjunction with natal Chiron, but on July 23rd, it's going to go retrograde. So that is when its influence will probably start waning. Uh, Previously, uh, we've had transiting Chiron in opposition to Saturn. And since natal Saturn and natal Chiron are in kind of a wide opposition, we see a lot of the same stuff with both aspects. And some of the issues that have come to the forefront during these transits by Chiron have been climate change, mass shootings, a woman's right to choose to have control over her own body, political wounding by leaders, but at the same time, some in government uh, have been doing the right thing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on because when we get to the full moon in August, well, guess what? This conjunction is still going strong. Okay, the next aspect I want to talk about is transiting Venus, making a quincunx to natal Pluto. Usually, aspects from Venus aren't going to last that long, but Venus is slowing down to turn retrograde. And so this one lasts from about the, looks like mid July into just the beginning of August. Now, Venus has a lot to do with our values, what we like and what we don't like. Pluto has to do with the people in our country who hold the power, specifically the president. But since we have three branches of government, this can also represent the Supreme Court uh, and also Congress. So, what do I expect? I expect the government to be at odds with the values of the people. And this could be either Biden, Supreme Court, Congress, or all three of them. And certainly I see Biden having a lot of accomplishments, doing a lot of good things, but there's a disconnect between what he's actually doing and what a lot of the people think about that. And that's seen in his low poll numbers. Now, when it comes to the Supreme Court, they have certainly recently been doing things that the people really don't like. The Supreme Court, as a base of power, it hasn't really been reflecting the values of the people for quite a while. Congress, well, we know what the people think about Congress. So let's move on. Now, another aspect, uh, which actually began around the beginning of May and goes on through the end of July, is transiting Saturn, making let's see, a quincunx to the north lunar node and a semisextile to the south lunar node. Now, the nodal axis, this represents some intense energy, and the intensity of that energy tends to cause interference. Saturn uh, tries to make things concrete. Saturn rules structure. So it wants to bring things in to reality. And since Saturn is currently in Pisces, it wants to bring its dreams and visions into reality. But the aspects we have here between transiting Saturn and the nodal axis, that will probably cause some interference and require some adjustment. So, what do I expect? Interference and adjustments to plans to bring dreams into reality. And some of what we have seen so far have been difficult debt ceiling talks, student debt plan canceled by the Supreme Court, military promotions and nominations held up by just a single individual, Senator Tommy Tuberville, who is holding up uh, all of what the military needs until he gets what he wants. So those things are happening, and more things will probably happen between now and the end of July. Okay, now here's some of the good stuff coming up. We have transiting Uranus making a trine to natal Neptune, and this is in effect from around the actually late June until early November. So this is going to be in effect for quite a while. And this represents creative visions by either government, the private sector, or individual people. What will happen? I don't know, but I'm keeping an eye on this one. Now, the fact is, when government does something bad, we tend to hear about it immediately. When government does something good, something innovative and creative, uh, we don't often hear about it. Quite often, that is not the headline news story. It may be buried somewhere toward the end of the news, or it may not even make the news. So I'm sure there's a lot of creative innovations and visions that are going on right now, but they don't always make the news. And so I'm going to be looking at the news more carefully to see what things happen that are related to this nice trine between transiting Uranus and natal Neptune. Okay, here's another good aspect. Transiting Neptune, making a sextile to natal Pluto, and Pluto represents people in power and the president specifically, and Neptune represents vision. And it's still in Pisces, it's home sign, so that's a lot of vision, a lot of compassion. And let's see, this has been in effect since about May through the first week of September. So I wrote up here, the president acts with compassion, vision, and charisma, May through August. And some of what has happened so far is Biden achieves a deal to raise the debt ceiling that was worked on in May and culminated in early June. More recently, Biden met with King Charles III to discuss climate change, and then he met with Prime Minister Sunak in Great Britain, and the two leaders agreed to strengthen economic ties. So this is helping with President Biden's vision and his charisma and his compassion toward people. And I see him acting in those ways. Okay, another good aspect. We have transiting Chiron, making a sextile to natal Mars. Since the sextile is a more harmonious aspect, I expect that we will see a bit more of the transcendent healing side of Chiron. And this will help mitigate some of the wounding related to transiting Chiron conjunct natal Chiron. So what do I expect? This is in effect from June through mid-September. I expect actions to heal the country and to heal veterans. And some of what I've seen have been Biden is now pursuing an alternate path to student loan forgiveness. He's also announced $115 million in funding for legal services for homeless veterans, and he's announced $58 million in funding to help homeless veterans find jobs. So those are all ways in which the president is acting with compassion toward people, trying to heal things. And as you can see, some of those things involve the military veterans in particular. Okay, moving on to July 24th, I want to talk about the square between transiting Mars and natal Uranus. Now, this is actually going to last only a few days, so this is a shorter period of time than what I usually consider. Hence, why am I talking about it now? Well, I want to keep an eye on this aspect because remember in January, for almost the entire month, transiting Mars was stationary at 8 degrees Gemini, which put in conjunction with natal Uranus in the USA chart this July 2nd, all the July 1776 charts. And as a result, during that period, we saw rebelliousness, particularly in Congress, over the fight to elect a new speaker. We saw a lot of violence. January 2023 went down as the most violent January on record in terms of mass shootings. And right before the beginning of January, but while transiting Mars was still within orb of conjunction with natal Uranus, we saw people attacking our power grid in various states. So, all of these things happened around January during the much longer conjunction of transiting Mars with natal Uranus, and hence we might revisit some of those things when we arrive at this waxing square between transiting Mars and natal Uranus. The only good news is that this period of tension is going to be much shorter than a month, just a few days. All right, now let's look at the full moon in America. The full moon happens on August 1st, 2023. And guess what? As I indicated earlier, transiting Chiron is still very, very close to exact conjunction with natal Chiron. The only good news is transiting Chiron is now moving retrograde, so it's moving away from that conjunction. This will still last, however, through all of August and into around the first week of September. So again, we have these same questions: wounding or transcendence? Remember, it went retrograde on July 23rd, and issues so far have been climate change, mass shootings, woman's right to choose, political wounding, but some in government doing the right thing, some responding with transcendence rather than wounding. And I also want to point out that we're repeating Watergate and many of the things that happened in the early 1970s. So let's take a quick look at that. From 1972 to 1975, transiting Chiron made a series of oppositions to natal Saturn and a series of conjunctions to natal Chiron in the July 1776 charts for America. These aspects can trigger either wounding, healing, or transcendence. And the major story during this period was the Watergate scandal and the Senate Select Committee to investigate President Nixon and that scandal. Also, the environmental movement was very prominent at that time, and Roe v. Wade in 72 or 73. I think it was around that time. I forget which year right now. Roe v. Wade was decided and abortion was made legal for women. Women were given that right to have control over their own bodies. Okay, we're going through uh, the same aspects now. Chiron was in the sign of Aries back in the early 70s. It's in the sign of Aries now, again in opposition to Saturn. We've been through that. And now we're moving on to uh, a conjunction with natal Chiron. Looks like we have three of those in 2024. And we're having that near conjunction lasting almost this entire summer. So we're now experiencing both astrologically and in terms of events over the years from 2022 to 2025, things that are similar to what we saw in the 70s. So far during this period, we've seen the work of the January 6th committee and ongoing investigations and indictments of Donald Trump. Also, climate change and Roe v. Wade's in the news again. Okay, so we've lost that right. Women have lost that right nationally to choose an abortion. It's still available in select states, but it is being threatened. In the early 70s, the country was wounded by the actions of President Nixon. Uh, Now the country's been wounded by the actions of Donald Trump. In the 70s, one of the finer moments for Congress was the Select Committee to investigate Watergate and Nixon. And one of the finer moments this time around has been the work of the January 6th committee. Okay, so when astrological configurations repeat themselves, we often see history repeating itself. Or as people say today, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? What's happening is not exactly the same, but very similar. Okay. Now, another thing which is happening is we have the transiting lunar nodes making a square to natal Pluto. And this is going to cover the first half of August and a little bit into the second half. And remember, the lunar nodal axis, it creates an intensity of energy that's often hard to control. With it making a square to Pluto, that's going to create some sort of intensity surrounding the president and possibly other leaders in Congress or the Supreme Court. Exactly what will happen? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But again, I'll keep my eye on what happens politically in August. And we'll see how intense the political environment gets at that time. Okay. Also, transiting Saturn is going to make a semi-square to natal Chiron. This starts about the last week in July and goes through about the first 3 weeks of August. And a semi-square, it's like a minor irritation. It's a turning point of sorts, a moment in time when we're shifting gears, so to speak. And what this is going to do, Saturn is restriction, with it making a somewhat tense aspect to natal Chiron, that can cause more of Chiron's wounding. So there's going to be a heightened chance of wounding in the country during this period from late July through first 3 weeks of August. And this will intensify the current transiting Chiron, natal Chiron conjunction. As I said, probably cause a little bit more wounding, a little bit more difficulty than we would like. Okay. The key, though, might be to exercise discipline over ourselves and our own actions. And that can probably help us deal better with the transcendent influence of Chiron so that we become our better selves rather than experiencing wounding. Okay, also, at the time of this August 1st full moon, there is going to be a quincunx between transiting Jupiter and natal Saturn. Jupiter likes to expand and grow. Saturn likes to contract and regulate. And with the quincunx, uh, these two drives are a little bit at odds with one another. They have a little bit of difficulty coordinating their functions. And that means that some adjustments have to be made and uh, change usually winds up occurring. So what does this mean? Well, in this period from August through a little beyond the first week of October, there could be difficulty in implementing growth, possible fights in government overspending. This is because Jupiter is in Taurus, which has to do with resources, possessions, and money. And there could be possible difficulties with foreign governments. This is because Saturn is in Libra, which has to do with our country's relationships with other countries. So there's going to be a little bit of incoordination here. Hopefully we can overcome it. But again, I'll keep an eye on what happens. Now on August 8th, transiting Jupiter is going to make a semi-square with natal Venus. And this is in effect from about the last 3 weeks of August through all of September. And remember, a semi-square is a shifting of the gears at turning points. It can cause a minor irritation or disruption to things. And because Jupiter is in Taurus, this can have to do with government spending. Venus represents what the people like, what they don't like, the people's values. So government spending or values will be at odds with the people's values. There'll be some friction there. This aspect will likely work in a problematic way with transiting Jupiter quincunx natal Saturn. So this is probably going to impact this somewhat tense aspect between Jupiter and Saturn and probably make things work out a little bit more negatively. So I'm kind of expecting more budget fights ahead in government, among other things. And we may have a few more difficulties with other countries too. We'll keep an eye on it. Okay, now on August 13th, that is when transiting Pluto gets within 1 degree of an exact conjunction again with natal Pluto. We're not going to have an exact conjunction this fall, but we're going to have another near conjunction. And this is going to be in effect from mid-August through about the first week of December. So this will be impacting us for quite a while. And remember that when a country undergoes a Pluto return, historically, they either die, they either cease to exist, or they lose a lot of their power and influence. They become a minor power. Or they figure out how to renew themselves and revitalize themselves, and they rise again like the phoenix. Now, during the previous conjunctions between transiting Pluto and natal Pluto, we have been dealing with existential threats from both without and within. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been seen as a threat to all of Europe. Putin has indicated that he wants to go after more countries and incorporate more countries into with Russia and restore the old Soviet empire and probably go beyond that. And threats to Europe ultimately become threats to us because of our uh, treaty with NATO. We would have to enter into the fight. We've also had existential threats from within, and many feel like our democracy is currently hanging by a thread. Uh, we're still dealing with the after effects of the January 6th insurrection. We're still trying to hold people accountable uh, for their high crimes and misdemeanors. And we still have state legislatures that are trying to take power away from the people. So we have this near Pluto return starts in mid-August, lasts until early December. And these are the questions: Putin, Russia, or other foreign threats? Possibly more political scandals or revelations, domestic threats. As I said, our democracy remains fragile. So this is another big thing we have to keep an eye on this fall to see exactly what happens. But I do expect things to happen that are in line with this. Fortunately, there are also people who are working to renew our American democracy and renew our highest ideals. And things like the infrastructure bill that was passed under previous conjunctions of transiting Pluto with natal Pluto, that can go a lot toward transforming America rather than destroying America. So let's hope for the best and work for the best. Now, on August 16th, we have a new moon, and that is going to be the beginning of the next lunar month, and that is a story for another day. So this is pretty much where we're going to stop. So uh, let's see. I'm going to have to move a couple of things around so that I can read this. So let me move my camera up a bit. I'm just going to hold it like this for a minute. My previous video on how this lunar month will affect the world in general foresaw the potential for a lot of chaos and drama between July 17th and August 16th. Fortunately, the outlook for America appears better. Certainly, we're dealing with self-inflicted wounds still, and still struggling to preserve our democracy. But the lunar month ahead also contains the potential for many good things to happen to America. Things based on compassion, innovation, spiritual transcendence, and adhering to our highest ideals. The ultimate outcome, though, depends not upon the stars, but upon each of us. And the science of astrology, I call it a science now because as a statistician, mathematician statistician, I've seen a lot of studies, statistical studies that verify many of the traditional tenets of astrology. Not everything gets verified, but a lot does. So, in addition to being an art of interpretation, I think we can now also call astrology a science, even if others don't yet recognize it as the science that it is. So, continuing, the science of astrology can inform us about the hand we've been dealt, but beyond a point, it says nothing about how we will play the game. Ultimately, it's our choices, individually and collectively, that will determine our final fate. Hence, may we all choose wisely. Okay, and that is it for this presentation. So let's see if I can stop sharing my screen. Okay, and this is the conclusion of today's presentation. I'm soon going to follow this with another video, which will look at how the same lunar month is going to affect Russia and Putin. And trust me, that's going to be very interesting. So I hope to see you again soon. So long for now.